That morning, Eleanor Voss walked into the rundown garage at the end of Hartford Street, wearing Louboutins and a contempt she did not bother to conceal. Motor oil stained the cracked cement floor. A corrugated tin roof tapped its rust against the November wind. A man lay beneath a car, hands black with grease, not looking up. She tossed her business card onto the workbench not placed, tossed and spoke loud enough for the entire block to hear, "I don't think places like this should still exist in our development corridor." 3 weeks later, that same garage had 17 investors lined up outside its door, with a combined $9 million on the table, and Eleanor Voss was standing among them. What changed, and what it cost both of them to get there, that is the story worth telling. If you have ever been dismissed before you opened your mouth, keep listening. This one is for you. Sebastian Cole was 29 years old and had been running the garage for 3 years, which was long enough to know which floorboard creaked near the air compressor and short enough that he still noticed the smell of welding flux the way other men notice fresh coffee. The space itself was unremarkable from the outside. A roll-up steel door with a dent in the third panel he had never gotten around to having repaired. A pegboard wall hung with tools arranged in a logic that belonged entirely to Sebastian, not sorted by size, not by manufacturer, not by any taxonomy a visitor would recognize, but by the sequence in which a repair most commonly required them, the most frequent tools within arm's reach, the specialized ones at the perimeter. Anyone who worked in that garage for a week would have understood the system. No one except Sebastian had worked there long enough to understand it. The floor was stained beyond the possibility of cleaning, but swept every morning before 6, before Luna woke up, before the neighborhood had fully committed to being awake. On the rear wall, past the hydraulic lift and the steel shelving stacked with parts boxes and handwritten inventory binders, a large whiteboard occupied nearly the entire surface. It was covered edge to edge in mechanical drawings, numerical annotations, conversion tables, and chains of differential equations written in a hand so small and precise. It looked less like handwriting and more like something typeset in a technical journal. A visitor who understood the language would have stood in front of that board for a long time. A visitor who did not would have seen organized chaos and moved on. Very few visitors came. The ones who did were usually dropping off cars, collecting cars, or delivering the kind of news that arrived in envelopes with law firm letterheads, and most of them kept their eyes on the ground, which meant they missed the board entirely, which meant they consistently underestimated the man standing next to it. Luna sat on a low wooden stool near the base of the whiteboard, legs swinging, a spiral notebook open in her lap. She was 6 years old, with 2 dark braids and a pencil tucked behind one ear, in unconscious imitation of her father. She had a habit of drawing the same subject over and over, with variations she found endlessly satisfying. A car with wings, sometimes surrounded by clouds, sometimes with a small figure standing beside it that she said was her father. She held the latest version toward the lower half of her father's body, the only part of him currently visible, extending from beneath the chassis of the Honda Civic on the creeper. "Daddy," she said, "can your car fly?" Sebastian slid out from under the frame and pushed the face shield up to his forehead. He looked at the drawing with the same quality of attention he gave engineering schematics, not indulgent, not dismissive, genuinely considering it. "Not yet," he said, "but it won't need gas anymore." Luna added a small sun above the car and a wisp of cloud, and seemed entirely satisfied with this as an answer to her question. 3 years before this morning, Sebastian had been the lead systems engineer on a research project called Helios at a company called Axiom Dynamics, a mid-sized firm developing next-generation drivetrain technology out of a campus in suburban Chicago. The project had been substantially his: the conceptual architecture, the compatibility framework, the retrofit logic, the test protocols. He had written the first viable technical summary on a hotel notepad during a conference in Phoenix, and spent the following 14 months converting it from a hypothesis into a working prototype. Then his wife Rebecca died in a highway accident on a Tuesday in March, a delivery truck running a red light, the kind of event that has no arc, no warning, no argument to make against it. Sebastian was away from the office for 2 weeks. When he returned, he was handed a letter citing cultural misalignment, a phrase so vague it could mean anything, and therefore meant nothing anyone was willing to say aloud. Project Helios was quietly suspended. Several members of his team resigned in the months that followed. Sebastian packed his tools into the bed of his truck, drove to Boston with Luna asleep against the window, and leased the garage that had belonged to his father before the old man retired to Florida. He did not look for another corporate role. He did not update his resume. He set up a workbench, opened a new notebook, and started from the beginning, which was not the same beginning, because this time he owned every line he wrote. His phone buzzed on the workbench that evening while Luna slept on the cot in the back room. The name on the screen meant nothing to him. Oliver Bennett. The message was 4 sentences. It said the sender had spent 8 months attempting to identify the anonymous author of a 4-page technical summary posted to a specialist engineering forum the previous year. It said the search had led here, to this address. It said the work described in those pages was the most significant thing he had read in 30 years of evaluating technology. It said they needed to talk. Sebastian read the message twice. He set the phone face down on the bench. He pulled the face shield back down and went back to work. He did not reply that night or the night after. He was not being careless. He was being careful, which from the outside had always looked the same. Eleanor arrived 2 mornings later with Richard Hale beside her. Richard was 44, wore a slim gray suit over a pale blue shirt, and carried his tablet in the crook of his arm with the practiced ease of a man who used information the way other men use furniture to establish where the authority was. He was the chief operating officer of Voss Meridian Capital, which meant he was the instrument by which Eleanor's strategic decisions became ground-level actions, and he was very good at this function. He was also, as would become clear later, a person who had already run a quiet database search on the name Sebastian Cole sometime in the previous 48 hours, read what came back with careful attention, and said nothing about it to Eleanor in the car. The visit itself was transactional. Voss Meridian was assembling a site footprint along Hartford Street and adjacent parcels to support a $200 million mixed-use development, retail, office, and residential at scale. Sebastian's garage sat at the geometric center of the footprint. The lease expired in 31 days. Richard handled the delivery in the tone of a man explaining a train schedule. "We won't be renewing," he said. "Contact our legal team before Friday." Sebastian was leaning against the workbench with a shop rag in his hands, neither moving forward nor stepping back. He looked at Eleanor. She was looking at the whiteboard. For a handful of seconds, Richard watched Eleanor's eyes move across the surface of that board, tracking the diagrams, the conversion tables, the marginal equations. Then he shifted his weight, 1 step to his left, positioning himself between her sight line and the drawings. Eleanor's attention returned to Sebastian. She set her card on the bench. She delivered her line about development corridors. She turned to leave. Luna came running from the back room at precisely that moment, skidding to a stop when she registered the presence of strangers. She looked at Eleanor from knee height, with the frank, unguarded attention that only young children execute without offense. She took in the shoes, the posture, the expression. She looked at the business card on the bench. Then she looked at her father. "Daddy, are they taking our garage?" Sebastian placed one hand on her shoulder. His voice was the same temperature it always was. "Nobody takes what isn't theirs, sweetheart." Luna looked back at Eleanor one more time, then at the card on the bench, then quietly returned to her stool and picked up her notebook. She drew without speaking for the rest of the afternoon. What she drew, Sebastian noticed when he looked over her shoulder later that evening, was not the winged car. It was a door, a large door, half open, with light on one side and dark on the other. He did not ask her to explain it. Sebastian picked up the business card from the bench, looked at it, set it down. It was not the first time someone had walked into a space he owned and spoken to him as if the space already belonged to them. But it was the first time it had happened in front of Luna, and that distinction mattered to him in a way he did not try to articulate even to himself. That evening, Richard sat at his home desk with multiple windows open. He had reviewed Sebastian's patent filings in detail. He had cross-referenced the filing dates against the Axiom Dynamics employment records he had obtained through a contact. He had located the 2022 asset acquisition agreement between Axiom and Meridian Industrial Ventures, a holding entity organized under Voss Meridian's corporate umbrella, and found a clause in the original IP assignment language broad enough to be argued in several directions. He called a contact at the firm of Hale and Driscoll, which bore his name because his father had founded it, and spoke for 40 minutes about the theoretical basis for an intellectual property claim against Sebastian's patents. He did not call Eleanor. He told himself he was protecting the company's interests. What he was protecting was considerably smaller than that. Eleanor, at her desk on the 31st floor, spent the same evening reviewing the Hartford development file with an unease she could not attach to any specific fact. Richard's reply times had been slightly slow for several days. She made a note to ask him about it. She did not ask him. Oliver Bennett drove his 14-year-old Volvo to Hartford Street on a Wednesday morning and parked against the curb with the nonchalance of a man who has never derived any self-worth from the vehicle he drives. He was 52, with wire-rimmed glasses and a blue wool sweater, and he carried nothing. He stood in the garage doorway for nearly a full minute, looking at the whiteboard, and Sebastian let him look because he recognized the quality of the attention, focused, not polite, the intake of a person holding a large amount of information at once. "This is the one you filed last month," Oliver said finally, touching the margin of the 7th diagram with one finger. It was not a question. Sebastian set down his wrench. "How do you know that?" Oliver withdrew a folded set of papers from inside his jacket. The 4-page technical summary Sebastian had posted to a specialist forum under no name in the spring of 2023. The pages were annotated in 3 ink colors, cross-referenced to printed patent abstracts, and paper-clipped to a handwritten research timeline. 8 months of patient, deliberate work, visible in someone else's handwriting on 4 pages that Sebastian had almost not published. "I've been looking for you for a long time," Oliver said. What Sebastian had built, described without requiring an engineering background, was a hybrid electromechanical drivetrain conversion module, a self-contained unit installable into any internal combustion vehicle manufactured after 1990, requiring no structural modification to the chassis. The installation took under 6 hours by a single mechanic. Material cost at production volume: under $4,000 per unit. The result was a fully functional electric drivetrain that weighed 40% less than any factory-built electric vehicle platform currently on the market, with no combustion emissions. The global aftermarket automotive service market was valued at over $260 billion annually. Sebastian's system made every gasoline vehicle ever manufactured a viable candidate for full electrification at an accessible price point. He had filed all 3 patents independently, paying the fees from garage service revenue because he had known from the beginning that the foundation would be attacked once the structure on top of it became visible. Oliver looked at him. "Do you understand what this is worth?" "I understand exactly what it's worth," Sebastian said. "I just hadn't found anyone I trusted enough to walk through that door." Luna appeared from the back room, marched directly to Oliver, and held out a drawing in both hands, the winged car again, this time with 2 figures standing beside it, one tall and one wearing a sweater. "Are you the person who helps Daddy's car fly?" she asked. Oliver took the drawing carefully, held it at arm's length, and gave it the attention it deserved. When he looked up, he was smiling for the first time since he arrived. "I believe I might be," he said. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. Sebastian walked Oliver through the framework, not as a presentation, not in the language of a pitch, but in the incremental way that engineers explain things to other engineers, starting with the constraint and working toward the solution. Oliver asked precise questions and wrote nothing down, which Sebastian noticed. A man who writes nothing down in a technical conversation either understands everything immediately or understands nothing at all. Oliver's questions made clear which category he was in. By the time Luna had fallen asleep on her stool, with the notebook in her lap and the pencil still in her hand, the 2 men had reached the edge of what could be communicated without a physical demonstration. Oliver scheduled a return visit for the following week. Sebastian still did not mention the lease or the Voss Meridian situation. He was not ready to put those 2 things in the same room. The letter from Hale and Driscoll arrived by courier 3 days later. 3 pages, single-spaced, arguing that Sebastian's patent filings constituted a derivative of work performed during his employment at Axiom Dynamics, and were therefore subject to the IP assignment clause in his original employment contract. It referenced the Meridian Industrial Ventures acquisition of Axiom assets and suggested that Voss Meridian might have standing to claim the patents directly. It requested cessation of all commercialization activities pending resolution. Sebastian read it at the kitchen table, while Luna ate cereal. He read it methodically, without urgency, the way he read technical documents, looking for the exact shape of the problem, rather than reading for catastrophe. When he finished, he folded it along its original crease and set it beside his coffee. Luna had put down her spoon. She watched him with the particular attentiveness of a child who has learned to read her father's stillness. "Daddy, did someone hurt you?" "No," he said. "Someone is testing me." She thought about this for a moment. "Are you going to pass?" He folded his hands around the coffee mug. "Yes." What Richard Hale had not verified, what Hale and Driscoll had apparently not troubled themselves to confirm, was the sequence of dates. Sebastian had received his termination notice on a Thursday and signed the separation agreement that same afternoon. That agreement contained an explicit IP release clause, confirming that all intellectual property developed after the separation date belonged solely to the departing employee. The first engineering notebook entry related to the retrofit system was dated 11 days after the signed separation agreement. The first patent filing was dated 9 months after that. There was no overlap. There had never been any overlap, because Sebastian had understood from the moment he sat in that HR office in Chicago that whatever he built next would need to stand on ground no one could reach, and he had been disciplined enough from the first notebook page to ensure that it did. He called Oliver that evening and explained the full situation, including Voss Meridian and the lease. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to organize a meeting." The conference room Oliver reserved at the Meridian Crown Hotel was private, second floor, with a projection screen at one end and a long oval table that seated 12. He invited 8 investors, including 2 senior partners from San Francisco venture funds, who had been tracking early-stage mobility technology for nearly a decade. Sebastian arrived in a dark jacket, no tie, with an external hard drive and a printed folder. Richard Hale arrived without an invitation. He was not stopped at the door because he carried Voss Meridian credentials, and the hotel had a standing relationship with the company. He entered with the unhurried bearing of a man extending a courtesy to the room and positioned himself at the far end of the table. He introduced what he called an unresolved question of intellectual property ownership that investors should be aware of before committing capital. He cited the Axiom contract and the Meridian Industrial Ventures acquisition in measured, carefully assembled language. Several people around the table exchanged glances. One of the California investors uncrossed his arms and leaned back. Sebastian opened his laptop. He did not stand up. He did not introduce what he was about to show or explain why he was showing it. He pulled up 3 documents on the projection screen. The first was his signed separation agreement from Axiom Dynamics, the IP release clause highlighted. The second was the opening page of his engineering notebook, scanned and archived with date stamps through a cloud backup service at the time of each entry, a habit he had maintained from the first week in the garage, because documentation done in real time costs nothing, and documentation reconstructed after the fact costs everything. The third was a single clean slide, 3 patent numbers, their United States Patent and Trademark Office grant dates, and the name of the sole registered inventor on it. The separation agreement was dated 11 days before the first notebook entry. The notebook entries predated the first patent filing by 9 months. Every link was time-stamped, archived, and verifiable by anyone in the room. Richard said nothing. There was nothing available to him to say. The legal argument he had constructed required ambiguity in the dates, and the dates had none. Oliver looked around the table with the patience of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment without advertising the wait. "I think that question is answered," he said. "Shall we continue?" The rear door of the room opened without sound. Eleanor Voss had been standing in the corridor since before the meeting began. She had learned of it from a junior associate who mentioned it without understanding its relevance. She had come alone, parked 2 blocks away, and stood in that corridor for 20 minutes, listening through the gap in the door. She was not in the habit of standing in corridors. She stood there because the question she had been unable to answer for 3 weeks was answering itself on the other side of the wall, and she needed to hear it finish. She walked in, crossed to the far end of the table, and looked at Richard. Not with anger. Eleanor's most definitive moments rarely featured anger, with the precise, measured weight of a decision already made. "Richard," she said, "please go home." The room absorbed this. Richard picked up his tablet. He left. No one watched him go. The terms came together in under 2 hours. Oliver led the seed round at $2,400,000. The California funds committed $3,800,000 combined. Independent investors completed the total, $9,200,000. Sebastian had his own attorney review the term sheet, which surprised no one in the room who had been paying attention to the evening. The attorney, reached by phone from the hotel lobby, confirmed the terms were clean. Sebastian returned to the table and said he would have a signed copy back within 48 hours. There were handshakes. There was, in the room, the particular kind of quiet that settles over a group of people who have just done something they believe in, not celebration exactly, more like the exhale that follows a long and careful effort. He had one condition. He stated it once, without apology or preamble. The Hartford garage stays. The address, the space, the sign. That is not a point for negotiation. Oliver looked around the table. No one objected. Richard Hale was on administrative leave before the following morning. Eleanor had spent the previous evening reviewing the internal email chain that had been copied, by standard company protocol, to a server she had access to. She saw the sequence in full. The database search on Sebastian, run and never disclosed. The call to Hale and Driscoll, also never disclosed. The small, deliberate step to the left in the garage that morning, positioning Richard's body between Eleanor's line of sight and the whiteboard. A sequence of small conceals, each individually defensible, together constituting a sustained effort to eliminate a complication that Richard had recognized as a threat and decided, without telling anyone, to manage on his own terms. The complication was a person's livelihood. That was the part Eleanor returned to. She met Richard in her office with the door open and placed the printed chain on the desk between them. She did not raise her voice. "You didn't do this for the company," she said. "You did it because you were afraid of what he represented." One beat of silence. "Leave the badge and the tablet on the desk." She drove to Hartford Street herself. It was late afternoon. Luna was on the concrete strip in front of the garage with a box of chalk in various colors, drawing on the sidewalk in the private language of a 6-year-old architect. She looked up when the unfamiliar car parked. She did not move. She waited with the unhurried patience of someone who has learned that not everything arriving requires a response, only the things worth responding to. Eleanor sat down on the concrete step at the garage entrance, which was lower than she was accustomed to sitting and not comfortable in the clothes she was wearing. She sat there anyway. "Can I see what you're drawing?" she asked. Luna pointed to the chalk figures on the sidewalk. A house, a garage structure, 3 figures. The one on the right wore a dress. The face was blank. "I don't know her face yet," Luna said. "So I left it." Eleanor looked at the drawing for a moment longer than the social occasion required. A 6-year-old leaving space for something not yet known. Rather than filling it in with guesswork, there was a kind of honesty in that which most adults had lost the confidence to practice. She stood, brushed the chalk dust from her palm, and looked at Sebastian. He had been standing in the doorway. For the first time in all their encounters, she looked at him without the infrastructure of her position arranged around her, and he looked at her without the quiet removal that is the only protection available to a person who has been treated as an obstacle. "Voss Meridian is withdrawing the development proposal for Hartford Street," she said. "I signed the order this morning." A pause, and then what came next arrived at a slightly different register, quieter, without the boardroom architecture the rest carried. "And I owe you an apology, not because of the investors, because of what I said the first day I came here, in front of your daughter." Sebastian did not say it was fine. He did not offer her the social ease of a quick absolution. He considered her for a moment with the same level, measuring attention he gave to everything he was deciding whether to trust. Then he nodded once. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee. It was the most ordinary sentence in the world, and also the most specific invitation, and everything that needed to be understood about it was understood by both of them. 6 weeks later, the garage on Hartford Street looked almost exactly as it always had. The sign had not been repainted. The third panel of the roll-up door still carried its dent. The metal roof still caught the wind on cold mornings and made itself heard. Inside, 2 young engineers worked at a second bench alongside Sebastian, both recent graduates, both drawn by a job posting Oliver had circulated through technical networks under a title that did not fully describe the work. They had both taken pay cuts to be there. Neither of them had mentioned this. Sebastian had noticed. On the rear wall beside the whiteboard, a framed document hung in a plain black frame. United States Patent Number 3, the third of 3, granted the previous month. 1 inventor listed. The other 2 hung on the same wall, each in the same plain frame, each with the same single name. Luna had started first grade. Each morning, Sebastian drove her to school in the converted Civic, which drew stairs in the drop-off lane because it ran without sound and without exhaust. The other parents had begun asking questions. He answered them briefly, and only what was asked. Oliver stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon for no meeting and no particular reason, except that he preferred this coffee to his own. He watched Sebastian work for a while without speaking, in the way that people who genuinely respect craft can observe it without needing to perform appreciation. "I've seen a great deal of technology over 30 years, Oliver said eventually. "I've seen people build things worth serious money. What I've never seen is someone do it the way you did in this building, under this pressure, without a trace of bitterness about the route it took." Sebastian kept his eyes on the work in front of him. "There was no detour," he said. "This was always the route." Oliver was quiet for a moment. "You had every reason to be angry." "I had Luna," Sebastian said. "That changes the arithmetic." Eleanor came on a Friday evening at no set time, and for no set agenda, with a paper bag that contained food for 3, which required knowing something about a 6-year-old's preferences that she had evidently taken the trouble to find out. Luna heard the car and came from the back room at a run, stopping in front of Eleanor with her full attention on the bag. "Did you guess what Daddy likes?" she asked. Eleanor glanced past her to where Sebastian stood in the garage doorway, watching. "I made an educated guess." Luna considered this for approximately 1 second. Then she took Eleanor's free hand with the complete, settled confidence of a child who has decided something is no longer a question and walked her through the garage door with the ease of a person leading someone to a place they already belong. Sebastian watched them pass. He had stood in this doorway on hundreds of evenings, alone with the light behind him and the quiet street in front, or with Luna asleep in his arms and nowhere to be, or once at 2 in the morning after completing the first full prototype, sitting on the floor with his back against the lift column, because he had not wanted that particular day to end. He had stood in this doorway thinking about Rebecca, the specific register of her voice, the way she had of filling a room without trying. The fact that grief does not diminish so much as it eventually learns to share the space with other things, which takes a long time, and then one day is simply true. He stood there now. Hartford Street was quiet in the early dark. The light inside the garage fell warm across the concrete floor. In the kitchen beyond the workroom, his daughter was explaining something at considerable length to a woman who was listening as though the explanation were the most important thing she had heard all week. The garage stayed. The sign stayed weathered. The dent in the door panel stayed. And Sebastian Cole, who had been told by a woman in the wrong shoes, and a man who was afraid, and a letter from a firm bearing a coward's name, that this place had no future and no value and no right to remain on the ground it stood on. Sebastian Cole looked at the open door of his own home and understood, clearly and without ceremony, that everything worth having was already inside it.